Hey everyone, it's February 12th, 2025. Welcome back to the Videntis podcast for our deep dive into today's top political news.
Definitely a lot to unpack today.
We've got a lot to unpack today,
Yeah.
from some unexpected shakeups at a key agency to a potential government shutdown and even
Protests erupting overseas?
Yeah.
It's kind of wild how these stories...
protests overseas. It's kind of wild how these stories,
Seemingly so different.
all point to the same underlying tensions, power struggles,
Yeah.
ideological divides, and the potential for
Significant consequences down the line.
Yeah, for sure.
Big time.
So let's start with some breaking news from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency,
CISA.
for those in the know.
Right.
17 employees, 10 of whom are regional election security specialists,
Wow.
have been suddenly placed on administrative leave.
Okay.
So what's the significance of this, especially given CISA's role in keeping our elections safe?
CISA's role is absolutely crucial, especially after the 2024 election.
Right.
We saw a massive amount of cyber activity. To put it in perspective, Cloudflare alone blocked over 6 billion cyber attacks during that period.
6 billion. That's wild.
It's a lot.
And these regional specialists were specifically brought on board to bolster election security at the local level.
Right, exactly.
And this all happens just as we're heading into major elections across the country.
Uh-huh.
So it makes you wonder about the potential impact on election integrity. Especially for smaller jurisdictions that might not have the resources to handle these types of threats on their own.
Yeah, and you have to think about the timing of this too, right?
Right.
Like you said, we have elections coming up.
Uh-huh.
But also, there's been a lot of criticism of CISA lately.
That's true.
From some Republican officials who felt the agency overstepped its boundaries.
Yeah, new Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem
Exactly.
was among those voicing concern.
Voicing those concerns.
But, it's not just Republicans who are worried.
Yeah, that's true.
Even some GOP election officials like Kim Wyman,
Right.
former Secretary of State for Washington, she's a real leader on election integrity,
Absolutely.
are sounding the alarm, saying that sidelining CISA could leave a dangerous void in support for election security.
Yeah, it's a really tricky situation. And then on top of all of that, you have the fact that CISA is currently without a director.
That's right. Jenny Easterly left the position on January 20th.
Yeah.
And her replacement hasn't been named yet.
So you've got this leadership vacuum.
A vacuum at a time when
they're facing internal shakeups and external criticism.
Right.
It's a pretty volatile situation.
Speaking of volatile situations, let's turn our attention to another high-stakes battle brewing in Washington, the looming government shutdown.
Oh, yeah.
The stopgap bill passed last year was only a temporary fix.
Right.
And now we're on the brink of a potential shutdown on March 14th.
Yeah, and this time, the Democrats are using their leverage to push back against Republican plans, not just on spending for federal agencies,
Right.
but also on those 2017 Trump tax cuts that are back in the spotlight.
Right, and within the Democratic Party,
Uh-huh.
we're seeing very different approaches to this fight, right?
Oh, for sure.
You've got Representatives Ocasio-Cortez and Omar calling for a hardline stance,
Yeah.
urging their colleagues to play hardball. But then you have
Like Jeffries and Schumer.
more cautious voices like Jeffries and Schumer,
Right.
who are urging a more,
Strategic,
less confrontational approach.
Yeah, less confrontational.
It makes you wonder where public opinion falls on all of this.
Well, recent polling might surprise you.
Okay, interesting.
Despite all the negative press,
Mm-hmm.
Trump's approval rating is actually at 53%.
Wow.
And a majority of voters actually support the spending cuts he's proposing.
That is surprising,
Yeah.
given the amount of pushback we've seen.
Makes it a really tough fight for the Democrats.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, shifting gears now to a story with an international angle.
Okay.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's visit to a U.S. military base in Germany was met with some unexpected protests. And we're not talking about demonstrations from enemy forces. These protests came from American students.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So it was a group of 55 middle schoolers
Middle schoolers.
from Patch Middle School.
Wow.
They staged a walkout to protest Hegseth's policies on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI,
Oh, wow.
and LGBTQ plus rights.
Okay.
And it wasn't just the kids.
The parents were there too.
Adults, likely parents, were there too, chanting DEI and booing as Hegseth's delegation passed by.
That's pretty remarkable.
It's pretty remarkable, especially considering that this all happened at a DoDEA school,
A DoDEA school.
which, for those unfamiliar,
military families.
that's part of the Defense Department's own school system for military families,
Okay.
with over 67,000 students around the world.
Got it. So to understand these protests, we need to look at the specific policies that triggered them.
Right, we're talking about things like a ban on certain educational materials in Dodia schools.
Okay.
And restrictions on transgender individuals serving in the military.
And these policies stem from...
These stem from executive orders signed by President Trump on January 20th.
Interesting.
And it's worth remembering that Hegseth himself
Former Fox News personality.
was a former Fox News personality.
Right.
A controversial pick for defense secretary from the start.
He was.
His confirmation came down to a tie-breaking vote by Vice President J.D. Vance.
Wow, okay.
And this protest at the base,
Right.
it isn't an isolated incident.
I was going to say, this feels like part of a larger trend.
The administration's rollback of DEI efforts
And their stance on LGBTQ plus issues.
and their stance on LGBTQ plus issues is facing pushback
On multiple fronts.
on multiple fronts, both domestically and internationally.
Yeah, so we've got election security, government funding battles, protests over social policy.
It seems like all these seemingly disparate events have a common thread running through them.
What do you think that is?
It really does feel like
What's the connecting factor here?
yeah, what's the connecting factor here?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's about
It's about power, isn't it?
power.
Who has it, who wants it, and how far they're willing to go to get it.
How far they're willing to go.
And of course, ideology plays a huge role in all of this.
Yeah.
We're seeing these deep divides between different visions for what Americans should be,
Right, both domestically and on the world stage.
both domestically and on the world stage.
And those visions have very real consequences.
Very real consequences.
Not just for politicians, but for everyday people.
Absolutely.
If the government shuts down,
Right.
that could have a ripple effect across the entire economy.
Exactly.
We could see furloughs for federal employees,
Uh-huh.
delays in essential services,
Yep.
even economic instability.
And then you have the potential impact of rolling back DEI initiatives.
Yeah, what about that?
I mean, critics argue that this could exacerbate existing inequalities,
Okay.
undo a lot of the progress that's been made in creating a more inclusive society.
So let's not forget about the international implications of all of this.
Oh, of course.
Hegseth's trip to Europe isn't just about visiting bases.
Right, he's over there.
He's meeting with NATO allies,
Meeting with NATO allies.
discussing military strategy,
Yep,
especially regarding the ongoing war in Ukraine.
makes sense.
So I'm curious, what are his main objectives with these meetings?
I mean, one of the big things he wants to push for
Uh-huh.
is increased defense spending from NATO allies.
Hmm.
He's been pretty vocal about wanting to see European countries shoulder more of the burden
More of the burden,
when it comes to providing security assistance to Ukraine.
which might be a tough sell,
Right.
considering the U.S. has already provided a massive amount of aid to Ukraine over the past 3 years.
Absolutely. We're talking over $126 billion
$126 billion.
in collective military assistance from around 50 countries.
Wow.
So there's this growing sentiment within the Trump administration that European nations need to step up and contribute more.
And this all ties back to the America First agenda that Trump has championed throughout his presidency. But it seems to be creating some friction with our allies,
Yeah,
many of whom might not share that same perspective.
it creates this tension, right?
Uh-huh.
On one hand, the U.S. wants to see a swift end to the war in Ukraine.
Right,
Believes that European countries should be taking a leading role in achieving that.
right,
But on the other hand, European leaders have their own priorities and concerns.
Right.
And they might not be willing to simply follow the U.S. lead.
So we've got this complex web of issues, both domestic and international.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Election security concerns, a government funding battle that could lead to a shutdown,
Right.
social policy debates that are sparking protests,
And of course,
a war in Europe that shows no signs of ending anytime soon.
right. How do you even begin to unpack all of this?
I know, it's a lot to take in.
It really is.
And it raises some fundamental questions about the direction of our country
Absolutely.
and the state of the world.
Like, how will these policies actually impact the lives of everyday Americans?
The government funding fight, the tax cut debate, the potential shutdown,
Mm-hmm.
all of this has the potential to directly hit people's wallets,
Yeah. A government shutdown could lead to furloughs for federal employees,
right?
delays in essential services,
Uh-huh.
even economic instability.
Right, right.
And the tax cuts, while potentially beneficial for some, could also exacerbate income inequality
Okay.
and lead to cuts in vital social programs.
And with all this talk of America first, how will our relationships with allies be affected,
Good question.
especially when it comes to providing aid and support in the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, that's something we'll have to watch closely.
Yeah.
Definitely a risk of further straining those relationships if we're not careful.
Feels like we're standing at a crossroads.
Oh, crossroads, yeah.
The decisions made in the coming weeks and months
Could have a huge impact.
could have far-reaching consequences for years to come.
No doubt about it.
Now, before we wrap things up,
Okay.
there's one more story we need to address, and it's a bit of a doozy.
A doozy. Okay, I'm intrigued.
It involves the White House, the press, and a rather, well, interesting geographical term.
Okay.
Have you heard about the Gulf of America?
The Gulf of America.
It-
Can't say I'm familiar.
Well, apparently some conservative commentators have been using this phrase,
Okay.
Gulf of America, to describe something that's not an actual geographical feature, but rather a symbolic one.
Symbolic. Okay.
And the Associated Press, in their reporting, dared to actually map this Gulf of America,
They macked it.
creating a visual representation of this metaphorical divide.
I'm intrigued.
So what does this Gulf of America actually symbolize?
Yeah, what are we talking about here?
Well, according to those who use the term,
Okay.
it represents the growing divide between liberal coastal elites
Okay.
and the more conservative Americans living in the heartland.
Oh, so they're using Gulf as a metaphor
Right.
for the cultural and political chasm.
Uh-huh.
That seems to be widening by the day.
Yeah, widening by the day.
That's quite a visual, and I'm guessing the White House wasn't too happy
You guessed it.
about the AP's decision.
The White House has banned the Associated Press
Wait, they banned the entire Associated Press?
from press briefings and events,
Wow.
claiming that their report on the Gulf of America was biased and misleading.
It seems a bit extreme to ban an entire news organization
I know.
over one report, even if they disagree with the premise.
Yeah. And this whole situation raises some important questions.
It does.
About freedom of the press,
Yeah.
the role of satire in political discourse, the very nature of truth in our digital age.
Big questions.
But now let's get back to the issues we were discussing earlier.
Okay, sounds good.
With all this talk about divides,
Provides.
about different visions for America,
Yeah.
it almost feels like we're living in two different countries.
Like two Americas.
Two Americas, yeah.
With vastly different perspectives, priorities.
Even realities.
And even realities.
And that makes finding common ground and bridging this divide
All the more challenging.
all the more challenging, especially when you consider
Social media.
social
Well,
media, right?
And the fragmentation of the media landscape
Uh-huh.
have created these echo chambers where we're constantly bombarded with information
Right.
that just confirms our existing beliefs,
And rarely engaging with opposing viewpoints
which makes civil discourse
and productive debate.
nearly impossible.
It's a recipe for
Polarization and gridlock,
polarization and grit.
eroding our ability to function as a cohesive society.
So where do we go from here?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed, powerless in the face of such daunting challenges.
I understand that.
But we can't afford to give in to apathy or despair.
No.
We need to stay informed,
Yes.
engage in critical thinking,
Absolutely.
and seek out diverse perspectives.
Diverse perspectives. I love that.
You know, be willing to listen to those who disagree with us,
Yes.
even if it's uncomfortable,
Even if it's uncomfortable.
and find ways to bridge these divides,
Uh-huh.
build a more united and resilient nation.
Right.
It won't be easy,
It won't be easy.
but it's essential for the future of our democracy.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said.
It's a reminder that we're not just along for the ride, we can actually steer the course a bit.
Absolutely. Thanks for that
Yeah,
insightful perspective.
you got it.
And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us for another thought-provoking deep dive here on the Videntis podcast.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
We'll be back soon with more in-depth analysis and discussions on the news that matters most.
Until then, stay curious, stay engaged,
Yes.
and remember,
Remember?
the future is ours to make.
And that's a wrap for today. Don't forget to check out our show notes for links to all the sources we discussed today. And be sure to subscribe to the Videntis podcast so you don't miss an episode.
Yeah, definitely check out the show notes. Always lots of great stuff in there.
Absolutely. Thanks again for joining me.
Always a pleasure.
And until next time, stay informed and engaged.
And keep those critical thinking caps on.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.
See you later.